Since the protagonist of last week's political figure episode was the poster child for the party switch, Strom Thurmond, I figured this week it was only appropriate to do his foil. The man who from Truman to Nixon was telling Strom and his ilk, "Bitch be gone," as he kicked them in the ass as they slowly left the Democratic Party. I'm talking, of course, about Minnesota's favorite son, Terminal 2. Hubert Humphrey. Apologies to the 99% of you who will not get that joke. Hubert Horatio Humphrey Jr. Yep, that's what his parents went with. Was born in Wallace, South Dakota, May 27th in the year of our Lord, John Browning. Hubert's family owned a pharmacy, and when Hubert came of age, he got his 2-year pharmacy certification in 6 months and started helping out with the family business. Times were tight in the 20s, and to supplement their income, they started making their own medication for both hogs and humans. They became known as the Farmer's Pharmacy. And despite the pharmacy and their concoctions becoming quite successful for a South Dakota small business, old Hubert hated the job. So he left and went on to get his bachelor's from the University of Minnesota, and then his master's in political science from Louisiana State University, because those definitely seem like the logical succession of schools to go to. After that, he went back to the University of Minnesota to teach and started working on his doctorate. When the U.S. joined the Second World War, Humphrey tried on 3 separate occasions to join first the Navy and then the Army, but was rejected each time due to medical reasons. So to do his part for the war effort, he ended up running various government agencies here in Minnesota that were designed to help with the war. In 1943, he made a strong but unsuccessful bid for mayor of Minneapolis. In 1944, he was a key player in merging the Farmer Laborer Party and the Democratic Party, creating the DFL, which is the Democratic Party that Minnesota has to this day. By 1945, despite being a raging progressive, he also ironically became a raging anti-communist. His efforts successfully purged communists and socialists from the DFL, which I think had long-term negative impacts on his own progressive goals for the party. In 1945, old Triple H would run for mayor again, and this time he would win, becoming arguably one of the best mayors of a major U.S. city in U.S. history. I wouldn't know it by looking at him today, but he worked to reform the Minneapolis Police Department, purging rampant anti-Semitism and racial discrimination. He made a fair employment committee banning racial discrimination in the city's workforce, also formed a council on human relations for Minneapolis, and notably reduced the city's crime rates. In 1948, under pressure from racist Southerners, the Democratic Party was trying to avoid making the minority plank or civil rights issues a major party platform. The Truman administration was desperately trying to avoid bringing up the minority plank and civil rights issues at the Democratic convention, and old Hube was going to have none of that. Hubert took the stage at the convention, gave all the moderates and the racist Southerners the middle finger, and said, "To those who say we are rushing the issue of civil rights, I say we are 172 years too late. For those who say that civil rights is an infringement on states' rights, I say it's time for the Democratic Party to step out from under the shadow of states' rights and into the bright sunshine of human rights." Mic drop, minority plank gets added to the platform. True to triggered Southern form, melting like a little snowflake on a Texas sidewalk, the delegation from Alabama and Mississippi stormed out of the hall. An old scumbag Strom Thurmond from South Carolina decided he was going to punish the Democrats by seceding from the party and creating the Dixiecrats in an attempt to split the vote and make Truman lose the election. And that went about as well as the last time South Carolina tried seceding. Turns out everybody thought the Southerners were just whiny little bitches, and Truman won in an upset without any of their support. In 1949, H. Cubed would run for Senate and become the first Democratic senator elected in Minnesota since the last time the South tried seceding. But remember, the party switch didn't happen. Now, obviously, the Southern senators of the Treason tribe were initially not big fans of Humphrey. Senator from Georgia even said, "Can you imagine the people of Minnesota sending that fool down here to represent them?" To which I like to at least imagine that Humphrey turned to them and said, "Why don't you go ask Virginia what happened when Minnesota needed to send some fools down to represent them at Gettysburg the last time you racist assholes needed to be taught a lesson. In fact, you should swing by our state capitol later. I got a real cool souvenir I want to show you." Just a little flag we picked up out of your cold dead hands to commemorate kicking your ass. Now, as a senator, Hube Cubed was a fucking bamf. Peace Corps, Food for Peace, Medicare, Humane Slaughter Act, Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, all Humphrey's babies. In fact, the only reason the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ever got passed was because of Hubert Humphrey's parliamentary games and just pure political power, whipping and arm-twisting people into voting for it. By far one of the most powerful, impactful, successful senators in U.S. history. But he wasn't all great. Continuing with his weird anti-communist obsession, he tried to make being communist a felony and suggested we put communists in internment camps. Thankfully, this constitution-violating legislation never got passed, but nonetheless, pretty fucked up. Humphrey had long had presidential aspirations, but being relatively poor, he lacked the funds to run a successful primary campaign. So he decided to use his leverage of having authored and gotten passed the crowning legislation of LBJ's presidency, the Civil Rights Act of '64, to make himself LBJ's choice in his election campaign following the Kennedy assassination. He took the job really seriously, aggressively campaigning for Johnson around the country, talking to working people about the things that were directly affecting them, and was never shy about calling out Barry Goldwater's bullshit. And of course, LBJ won, making Humphrey vice president of the United States. With tensions in Vietnam escalating, LBJ started taking a very aggressive stance about U.S. military presence in the region, a stance Hubert adamantly and publicly disagreed with. This made LBJ less than happy. So in response to Humphrey's criticism, LBJ told him that if you ever publicly disagree with me or criticize my policy again, I will make sure that any presidential aspirations you ever have are crushed. He then punished Humphrey by kicking him out of his inner circle for months and making him sit on the sidelines. As a result, Humphrey started towing the line and publicly supporting LBJ's Vietnam War efforts, all to the dismay, disappointment, and disapproval of the progressive following he had built over his career. Humphrey went on to lament this decision, saying that he lost some of his personal identity during his 4 years as vice president and shouldn't have let a man who was going to be a former president dictate his future. Unfortunately, LBJ contributed to killing Humphrey's presidential aspirations, not because he disagreed with LBJ, but because he went along with him. Nonetheless, that didn't stop him from unsuccessfully trying to cinch the nomination again in 68 and 72. After the vice presidency, he went back to teaching at Macalester College in the University of Minnesota and sat on the board of consultants for Encyclopedia Britannica. During this time, Richard Nixon used Hubert Humphrey as a bipartisan consultant on Vietnam and Cold War relations, but that did not stop Humphrey from calling out Nixon for his divisive and polarizing politics. In 1970, he returned to the Senate, giving him the rare distinction of being one of the few senators to have held both Senate seats in his state. Once again a junior senator, he had lost a lot of his political power and influence within the chamber. Nonetheless, he would spend his remaining years in the Senate fighting for labor rights and education and healthcare reform, limiting U.S. military interventionism. Hell, he even proposed a bill that would guarantee full employment to every U.S. citizen over the age of 16 and outline the public jobs necessary to make that a reality. Despite being ironically scared of socialism, the dude was basically Bernie fucking Sanders. Tragically, in 1977, Humphrey was diagnosed with terminal bladder cancer. For his final trip to Washington, D.C. in October, President Carter honored him by giving him command of Air Force One. Upon leaving the Senate, Humphrey would leave us with some words of wisdom. He said, "The moral test of government is how the government treats those in the dawn of life, our children, those in the twilight of life, our elderly, and those in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped." A few short months later, on January 13th, 1978, Hubert Humphrey passed away at his Waverly, Minnesota home. Upon his death, his wife Mariel was appointed to hold his position in the Senate until a special election could be held to fill his seat. And despite all of his faults, when we lost Hubert Humphrey, we lost a man full of values, honor, and integrity that Washington has been and continues to be painfully devoid of. The man made Minnesota very proud, and I hope that he's resting in peace.